My name's Nick Richardson. I'm CEO of the Melbourne Press Club. Thank you very much for joining us today at this special lunch. We're delighted to have our guest today. I'd like to begin by going back in time a little. Not far, just to earlier this year. Channel 7 is one of the most durable news rating success stories in the nation, but within the space of a few weeks, its Director of News and Current Affairs has resigned following the mistaken identity of a Sydney University student as the Bondi Junction attacker and the revelations about the network's spotlight programs dealing with Bruce Lehrmann. Into this very concentrated media focus, this whirlwind of events, steps a newspaper editor who has no broadcast experience, who's been given the top job of running Seven Network's News and Current Affairs division. The other slight wrinkle in this plan is that he's based in Perth, where he's been busy launching the nation's first digital evening publication and presiding over the West Australian newspaper, the Sunday Times, Perth Now website, and a tribe of regional and suburban titles. But Anthony Ceglie is up for the challenge. And if there's an obvious thread in Anthony's career, it's an abiding commitment to journalism. From where he started at the Collie Mail in regional WA, to his time as Deputy Editor of The Telegraph in Sydney, to editing The West Australian. The proof of this commitment, perhaps, is in his trophy cabinet, where there are 3 Walkley Awards. But it would be wrong to see Anthony as an old-school journo with only ink in his veins. He's a contemporary journo who also seems to have a few gigabytes in his veins. He's an apostle for digital storytelling and the primacy of video. He's also someone who appears to be happy to shake things up. Since he's been in the top job at Seven, he's brought in a satirist to the evening news bulletins, and he has some firm advice for the federal government about how to value important journalism and the power of telling the truth. 6 months after he took on the top job, please welcome Anthony Ceglie to the Melbourne Press Club.
Greetings, everyone, and firstly, thank you to the Melbourne Press Club for inviting me to talk today. And I reckon that's the first time anyone's got my surname right twice in one, so well done. Look, it's a real honour and a privilege to be here, and I'll try my best to make the time worth your while. And consequently, for those who care, my star sign rating for today is supposed to be 3 stars, so I think that bodes kind of okay. We'll see how we go. But star signs, satire, and daring to be different in legacy media is something that I'll get to shortly. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge their leaders past and present. There is no doubt in my mind that the big media companies owe a debt to Indigenous Australians for the reporting mistakes of our past and what that did to ingrain racism in this country. It's a debt we're still working off, and I know that there is a lot more to do. I want to make special mention of my wife, Sarah, who is in the audience today. Sarah is a very successful lawyer, so firstly, I need to thank her for risking her billable hours to be here today. Sarah and I have 2 wonderful children, a 6-year-old boy called Levi and a 3-year-old girl called Esme. I think any journalist who's worth their salt will admit it's a profession that takes a heavy toll on your loved ones and your friends. The pursuit of a story can take over every facet of your life at the drop of a pin. And the all-consuming nature of getting a scoop can then very often turn into a non-stop anxiety train as you deal with the fallout of your yarns. Far too often, frivolous lawsuits mean this stress can last for months or even years. God knows how or why any of our partners put up with it. On that note, I also want to give a shout out to my good friends and supporters who are in the audience. Among those is a very special one in Paul Nash, who's down the back because he always chooses the most quiet spot in the house. Paul has been a mentor of mine since I was 24, selflessly offering me support and guidance now for 15 years as I navigate my career. Thank you, Paul. There's a few themes that I will discuss today, from ensuring traditional journalism doesn't sleepwalk into oblivion, to resetting the performance culture inside newsrooms, and how the government simply must step up and do more to safeguard the fourth estate at a time when Australia is seriously looking down the barrel of a dystopian post-truth world. But the overriding theme of any talk I give about my career and the industry is always that I love journalism. The truth is that I've never seen journalism as a job. Well, not a real job in the 9 to 5, punch in, punch out, daily grind kind of way. It's too damn exhilarating to be a job. Every day is too unique, every character is too colourful, and the endless possibilities to drive real and meaningful change is too real. If we must call journalism a job, then surely it's the greatest job on the planet. But there's no doubt in my mind that it's now under threat more than ever. It's either under threat from a lack of risk-taking, or it's under threat from a lack of government support. I'm a big whiteboard person. In every office I've worked out of, there's always been a noticeably large whiteboard with my scrawling all over it. It has my to-do list, it has upcoming events, it has all those stupid, crazy midnight ideas that I want to explore further. And among those on my whiteboard are a bunch of quotes and mottos that I use to hold myself and the team around me accountable. Some of those quotes are total non-stop innovation, don't sit still, turn it up to 1,000, ignore the noise, and that risk is for the taking. There's a picture too that has been on every whiteboard that I've had since I became a senior news leader. It's the cover of the January 1973 edition of the satirical National Lampoon's magazine. For those who don't know, this was the deaf issue. And on the cover is the most doe-eyed looking border collie you've ever seen. It's the kind of dog that would always win best dog at the Royal Show. The magazine shows a hand pointing to the dog's temple, and in massive font the headline reads, "If you don't buy this magazine, we'll kill this dog." Look, I love that cover for a bunch of reasons. But I keep it on my whiteboard because in my mind, it epitomises the fight that traditional media is in. TV, radio, newspapers, magazines, even our online websites are in a 24/7 battle to survive. We need to grab our audiences by the scruff of the neck, shout in their faces that they must buy or view or consume our products as a matter of life or death. It used to be that we were competing with each other, and that was hard enough. But now our biggest threat is TikTok, X, Instagram, and even ChatGPT. In the case of TikTok, it's no longer 7 versus 9. It's both of us versus an algorithm powered by the Chinese government. In the case of X, it's no longer News Corp versus Fairfax. It's the Australian media up against Elon Musk, whose net worth is currently valued at more than $250 billion US dollars. And we're also up against time. Double income families working overtime to keep up with cost of living pressures need a very, very good reason to care about our content. Put as plainly and as simply as I can, we cannot rest on our laurels. We need to turn it up to 1,000. We need to do it every single day. The crazier the idea, the better. I joke, but that's why I encourage taking chances, like introducing star signs into the 6 p.m. bulletin to widen our demographic, or adding satire at the end of the week with Mark Humphries and his 6:57 p.m. news. We actually need more risk-taking in our industry, not less, if we want to compete. And for those keeping count, since we introduced our star signs and our satire, our ratings have gone up, not gone down. I'm not saying that's just because of these innovations, although it's worth highlighting that in Melbourne, under the new news director Chris Salter, who's in the audience, we've also introduced a very popular good news segment at the end of our bulletins. And in Sydney, the dynamic new news director Sean Power is at the cutting edge of thinking about our craft. My point is simply that Seven is trying new things, and the world isn't coming to an end. My first gig as a journalist was at a small regional newspaper in a mining town called Ceglie. My second gig was at a slightly larger regional newspaper in a town called Mandurah. I love regional journalism because it teaches you that every story counts. I always joke that if you get the lawn bowls results wrong, then you hear about it personally, and you're very likely to get accosted in the street by a grandmother telling you you've ruined her whole year. I use every chance I can to encourage aspiring journalists to start in regional areas. You're thrown into the deep end, but you also learn life values that stick with you. I swear I can walk into any metropolitan newsroom and pick out the people who first learnt their skills in a small town. However, it's not lost on me that the first paper I worked at no longer exists, and the paper that housed my second job no longer exists as well. They are among hundreds of news publications that have closed down in recent years, leaving our communities far worse off. I was fortunate to very quickly make my way up into a senior reporting role for the Sunday Times in Perth, and then I became a young chief of staff and then a young deputy editor of the then News Corp publication. During this time, I was also sent on secondment to New York. I loved every minute of it. But, and it's a big but, for nearly the first decade of my life as a journalist, it was almost like clockwork that every 6 months there would be a staff notice about forced redundancies or a call out for voluntary redundancies. There would be senior journalists sitting around me openly joking about waiting for their lottery ticket to come in when they'd finally be approved for a voluntary redundancy. There were some reporters who had already taken one redundancy, had come back and were waiting for a second. What frightened me most was that hardly anybody seemed in a hurry to change anything. Many would wax lyrical about the golden days, but were uninterested in helping to create a pathway for the next generation, or God forbid, the generation after that. I would try to pitch something different or ask why we were doing something a particular way, and I would get back the single worst phrase that you can hear in any workplace, because that's how we've always done it. So I always promised myself that if I was to take charge of a newsroom, I would leave no stone unturned, and I'd try to take as many risks as possible to reinvent the industry. In my early 30s, I became the deputy editor of the Daily Telegraph. I developed a theory alongside the then editor Christopher Dorr about how newspaper front pages had to evolve. It wasn't just enough to present the news. We had to come up with front pages that were timeless statements about the happenings of the world around us. Timeless in the sense that if you walked past the newsstand at 2 p.m. and had already heard or read about the story that morning, that you'd still stop and gawk because the way we presented that front page was so in your face or so thought-provoking. One day when I was editing solo, the Nice terror attacks occurred in France, leaving more than 500 casualties in their wake. Instead of the traditional front page treatment, I didn't publish a headline that day. Instead, I ran a tally of recent deaths from terror attacks that ran down the page one after another until those figures met the body bag of a victim. It was a front page designed out of Sydney that was heard around the world. It was highlighted in all the major international news shows covering the horror, and eventually even featured in a European anti-terror music clip. By daring to be different, it had the maximum impact. After that experience, I'm not sure I ever did a by-the-numbers traditional front page ever again. At the age of 34, I got a call out of the blue to meet Kerry Stokes, who I'd never met before, where I was asked if I'd return home to Perth to be the editor-in-chief of the West Australian and the now Seven West media-controlled The Sunday Times, along with its regional and community newspapers. Of course, I jumped at the opportunity. My front pages got wilder and wilder as I pushed the boundaries more and more. Some went well, some went very, very well, and some fell to the ground with a thud and got me into a lot of trouble. But as you'll keep hearing from me, you need to be bold to win. If we didn't dare to try, then we wouldn't have had moments where the West Australian became the talking point of the entire world. During the first Trump campaign, some of the biggest US websites on election day were leading their sites with our cover of the Statue of Liberty nervously peeking through her fingers at what the potential outcome was going to be. And I'll never forget the English cricket captain Ben Stokes tweeting about the West's front page, depicting him as a newborn in a nappy with a dummy in his mouth and the headline "Crybabies" during the Ashes stumping controversy. Of course, total non-stop innovation is more than just about doing a bold page one. It's about pushing your team to constantly reinvent itself. One of the things I was most proud of at the West was creating an audiovisual team led by former Today Tonight executive producer Nat Bonjolo that won many awards for its documentaries and also created the weekly show Up Late, which was a slightly more serious version of the 6:57 p.m. news. A high-performance culture is one that never utters the phrase, "That's how we've always done it." During my time at the West, I'm very proud to have founded 2 startup products with the backing, support and friendship of 7 West Media WA Chief Executive Morena Fuster. You can't take bold chances without a boss like Morena who matches your passion and your drive. Firstly, the grassroots live streaming platform Streamer for community-generated sports videos. And more recently, Australia's only digital evening newspaper, The Nightly. For those keeping score, The Nightly already has a bigger, unique monthly audience than the Australian Financial Review and is breathing down the neck of the Australian. The Nightly is now in the hands of Dory and the brilliant new West editor and close friend, Sarah Jane Tasker. About 6 months ago, I got another call from Kerry. This time it was about taking over as the Director of News and Current Affairs for Channel 7. Of course, I said yes again. I'm not here to dwell on the past, and you've all read the headlines about the happenings before my time. But looking towards our future, I've tried to bring with me into this new role the same high performance and boldly creative philosophies that have so far served me so well over my journey. One of the best bits of advice I ever got, and one of the best bits of advice I can give you, is that when you take on a new job, you need to move as fast as possible in your first 6 months. It's fitting that this speech essentially marks that anniversary of my time at 7. As it stands, my news leadership team at 7 looks almost entirely different from when I started. We have a new Director of News Operations in Gemma Acton. We have a new Sydney News Director in Sean Power. We have a new Melbourne News Director in Chris Salter, who, as I said, is here today. We have an incoming new Brisbane News Director in Erin Edwards. We have a new Adelaide News Director in Mark Mooney. We have a new 7news.com editor in Natalie Wolfe. We have a new Spotlight Executive Producer in Gemma Williams. We have a new National News Desk Director in Hugh Whitfield. We have a new Sunrise Executive Producer in Jake Lyle. We have a new Weekend Sunrise Executive Producer in Holly Fallon. We also have a host of new faces like Melbourne presenter Karina Cavallo and a new co-anchor lineup in Sydney and in Brisbane. Now, it should be noted that the leadership team has also retained the exceptional Director of Morning TV, Sarah Stinson, and the brilliant morning show executive producer, Chloe Finn. And I promoted the fearless Ray Kuka to be my deputy while continuing his role in running the Perth newsroom. I couldn't be prouder of the new team or feel more inspired about what we are about to achieve together. Our leadership team philosophy is pretty simple. No games, have each other's backs, leave no stone unturned in the pursuit of excellence, and be honest and accountable to each other. I'm a strong believer that as a leader, you also need to enforce a no dickheads policy. It only ever takes one person to disrupt an entire team. And if they're not dealt with, then they can become a cancer that infects the whole staff. Ryan Stokes has a leadership philosophy that he calls the owner's mindset. Its 10 guiding principles are also on my whiteboard. Among them are points like doers over delegators, value pace over analysis paralysis, and be crystal clear on the drivers. The final point in Ryan's guiding philosophy is my favourite, that everything in leadership is personal. Some industry insiders have commented on the relative youth of my team, with one columnist even dubbing us the romper room after the classic children's TV show. Of course, the irony was that most of us were so young we had no idea what they were talking about. And as I told them, if the biggest criticism we face is our age, then I'll take that any day of the week. In my first town hall to the news team at 7, I continued my tradition to encourage the staff to be bold. The TV world, in truth, can suffer badly from short-termism. Every day at about 9 a.m, the ratings come out, and you can physically see your staff hold their collective breaths as they check to see how they went. One old-school theory about the ratings-driven culture is that it creates an atmosphere of only 2 emotions, winning and losing. My advice for the teams has been to stop worrying about the ratings. Instead, worry about the journalism. I don't want to be in charge of a newsroom that doesn't have room for emotions also like pride, excitement, inspiration, joy, fun. The most important measure of success is being able to look at yourself in the mirror each night, knowing that you've done your job as a journalist well. The job is to give a voice to the voiceless and hold the powerful to account. It's not to worry about the ratings or set-top boxes. And if you're too busy worrying about last night's result, then you'll never take that giant risk or leap into the unknown that could unearth the next big thing. As I said earlier, Seven's biggest competitor isn't Nine anyway. The journalists and the producers and the editors and the camera operators and everyone else at 7 and 9 and 10 and the ABC and the SBS have so much to be proud of. The data actually tells us that the public recognises this. I just wish that the government did too. It gets lost on many people that every single night across Australia, the number 1 and the number 2 program on TV is the 6 p.m. news. Combined, 7 News and 9 News reach an astonishing 3.6 million people on average every night. That's every single night. In fact, there's only 2 events of the year that this massive reach of the 2 6 p.m. news bulletins combined does not beat: the AFL and the NRL Grand Final. I believe that Channel 7 and Channel 9 are news companies first and foremost. It's in our DNA. It seeps out of our pores and into the living rooms of Australians. We are the shining light on the hill in an increasingly dystopian world of conspiracy theorists and deep fakes and anti-vaxxer cookers. Elon Musk doesn't care about the truth. In fact, he revels in peddling lies and boasts about using his bin fire of a site to influence the US election. Meanwhile, Mark Zuckerberg is seemingly happy for Meta to profit off the page impressions that child sex offenders create when they routinely use his site to prey on their next victim. Not even the parents of dead children have been enough for Facebook to take seriously the harm that it is doing to society. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has labelled Meta arrogant bullies who should fess up to the damage that they have caused. New South Wales Premier Chris Minns has spoken many times about how social media platforms cynically use algorithms to push dangerous conspiracy theories onto impressionable people, creating a vicious spiral down a rabbit hole that he calls the dark corners of the internet. Against these evil forces, and calling them evil forces is not an exaggeration, there is only one true antidote, and that is the news, the truth, the fourth estate. In a world where the proliferation of misinformation has never been worse, our role as journalists has never been more important. We are the only antidote, but we cannot do it alone. And the government, who tells voters so often of their fears about social media, needs to realise this, it needs to step up, and it needs to help us. If the Prime Minister is so genuinely worried about the toxicity of Facebook and Meta and X and TikTok, then bloody well give a helping hand to the journalism that fights for the facts. The government needs to stop treating Australia's news stations with disdain. Every day across our nation, Channel 7 proudly produces about 26 hours of journalism. But just like those regional newspapers that I started my career at, we can't promise that we'll keep doing that forever. The government acts like newsrooms are still bathing in the rivers of profits. It does this at a high cost and a high risk to journalism and the Australian democracy. Free-to-air networks like Channel 7 still pay an archaic broadcast tax that was designed 60 years ago during an era of super profits that simply no longer exist. At a time when a viewer can access 10 hours of news on 7's free-to-air channel on any given day, the so-called commercial broadcast tax is actually just a tax on journalism. Even more so, it's a tax on the truth, and it's a tax on facts. And it's a tax on the only antidote to combating the rise of harmful online platforms. The cost of the commercial broadcasting tax this year for stations like 7, 9 and 10 combined will be about $45 million. I asked the Albanese government, how many jobs do they think that is? How many TV newsroom shifts will disappear so that we can pay it? How many regional reporters will have to be let go? How many more redundancy call-outs will be made because of a meaningless tax from a bygone era that is nothing more than a rounding error for the budget coffers. No other compatible jurisdiction in the world places tax burdens of this kind on broadcasters. Licence fees paid by Australian broadcasters are now the highest in the world at 52 times more than the equivalent per capita charge of our US peers. Make no mistake, I am using today's speech to call on the Albanese government and the Dutton opposition to vow to scrap the commercial broadcast tax immediately in the name of journalism. The future of the news and the future of the truth in our democracy depends on it. I want to go one step further though. The government must also immediately investigate a rebate for the costs of producing news and current affairs. They already have a rebate for the production of Australian dramas like Home and Away and for Australian democracies. The government has already decided that it's so important to have this local content for our national psyche that it should be subsidised. I would argue that it's even more important for our residents to safeguard the future of Australian news. There are all kinds of rebates in other industries, and us journalists do a very good job of helping other industries like miners and small businesses lobby for change. It's high time that we did it for ourselves. Our democracy literally depends on the strength of our journalism. And as I said earlier, journalism is the greatest job and the greatest privilege in the world, but we need help, and we need it right now. Thank you again for the Melbourne Press Club for affording me this opportunity to talk, and I of course look forward to taking your questions. Thank you. Need to turn it on. Is that working?
That's it. Yeah, now there we are. So Anthony and I are going to shoot the breeze for a little while, just talk amongst yourselves. No, I'll ask him some questions and then I'll open it up to you for your opportunity to ask some questions as well. So let's go back a step to a couple of things you raised there. In terms of the changes you've made to the leadership, significant, as you say, and extensive, and you've, in a sense, radically changed the way the organisation looks. Does that mean that the culture that you saw when you arrived was flawed and dysfunctional?
Good question. Look, I think it's not my place, in all sincerity, to talk about the past. Like, I wasn't there for it. I was doing something else. But what I will say is that actions speak louder than words. And I think as a leader, like, the most important thing you can do is to act. And, you know, I look at my progression over my career from a young 25-year-old chief of staff to a deputy editor to an editor. And I'm proud of the fact that I like to think that I've always acted when I've seen something that I don't think is appropriate, to the best of my knowledge. And so I think, I can't speak to the past, but what I can speak to is that I am very proud of the team we have, and I am filled with the utmost confidence that the people that we have now are the people that will take Channel 7 forward.
So if I might reframe it for a moment. So coming from a newspaper background, did you think the culture of a newspaper newsroom is different to a broadcast newsroom?
It's another good question. Yeah, look, I do think newspapers, I would say the difference in newspapers is that there's a lot more sort of senior leaders around. Like, I think people underestimate newspapers can be a much bigger beast. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot more storied, experienced, award-winning people floating in and out every day. And you take that for granted. I think it's underestimated how lean and mean our TV stations operate. And, if you came to the West Australian, for example, I mean, that floor is 90% the West and 10% Seven. Mm. So I do think that there is something to be said about newspapers, just the longevity of people in a newspaper versus that short-termism, I think, that can happen in TV, where I think people get burnt out quickly. There's that daily ratings sort of battle that I spoke about. Whereas in TV, it can feel a little bit more long term in the way we look at things, or the way we did look at things, and I do think that plays into it a little bit, for sure.
Because of course, newspapers and their digital iterations will certainly pay attention to clicks and view it, all that kind of thing. But broadcast newsrooms are very much, as you've identified, very vigilant about the ratings. So are you looking to change, how do you actually change that focus that's been embedded for such a long time?
I think actions speak louder than words. I mean, hopefully Chris is in the audience, and hopefully he can attest that I've never rang him up and asked about the ratings once, right, in terms of what happened last night. The other thing about the ratings is we know that it's a system that, it's a dark art, right? We're talking about a couple of set-top boxes here and there often. And so, I think it's upon our leaders to embrace journalism, embrace hard work, embrace the right culture, rather than embracing a winning at all costs mentality. And you got to choose the right people that will hold to that ideal steadfast, even if there's a bump in the road. And I always laugh about Mark Humphries, and the very first, we went to air with one episode and people wanted to tell us that the ratings had dropped. And none of it made any sense, and the ratings had actually gone up. But there was just that immediacy of wanting to think that something's going to have one chance at success. And if it doesn't work, you're going to throw it out. And I just don't believe in that.
You mentioned about taking risks and, that kind of boldness. Do you feel that there are some things that you wouldn't do, that there is a limit at some point?
I think there's always a limit, but I think the limit is just making sure we're still doing the journalism really well. I think we have to. I'm very, like I said, I've spent 15 years in this industry, or however long it is now, and the biggest regret I've ever made is when I haven't tried something. Like I used to say about front pages, you never wake up the next day kicking yourself that you've tried something, but you do wake up the next day when you had an idea, you didn't go for it, and then you go, Jesus, I really should have done that. And so my motto is always try, and if it fails, then, we just fix it.
In an industry where there is so much change and so much pressure, how much appetite is there, do you think, for that kind of risk-taking?
Hopefully a lot. I think it's okay. I think you live and die on what you produce in this business, and thankfully most of the risks that I've taken over my career have paid off. But there have been times where they haven't paid off, and you work your way through it. But I do genuinely think that we are in the fight of our lives, and anyone who thinks, getting back to that ratings question, anyone who thinks that because we win the ratings on a Tuesday night we're successful is not looking at the right metrics anyway. Like I said, our fight is for relevance, and we are in a fight for relevance against so many different platforms that if we don't take risks and we don't try to be bold, then we might as well give up anyway.
So the rebate idea that you've raised and the broadcasting tax, have you spoken to your colleagues at the other networks about lobbying about this, and what's been the response?
Yeah, look, the industry lobby groups have actually, believe it or not, been pushing for it for a couple of years. But I think the point that is getting lost in it, which I'm so passionate about, is that idea that in any given day, if 10 hours of the 24 hours that Channel 7 does is journalism, then it's not a broadcast tax anymore, it's a journalism tax. And there is no doubt that all of us are looking at cost cutting all the time. And you can't, that $45 million that we're paying each year will save jobs. It will save jobs and save regional newsrooms. And it'll be the difference between us being able to hold Facebook to account and not being able to hold it to account. And I think the argument has been lost a little bit in that we needed to bring it back home to the thing that matters most, which is it's a tax on journalism. And also don't forget, we're free, right? ABC, SBS, Channel 7, Channel 9, Channel 10, we're free. We're a very important quality journalism service that is free. There's a lot of people that can't afford to pay for digital subscriptions. So it's actually a tax on free journalism.
Okay. I might throw that open to the floor. Maddie has our roving microphone, so Thanks very much. If you could identify yourself and who you're with, I'd appreciate it. Thank you very
Hi,
much.
Anthony. My name's Mark Santo Martino. I'm a reporter here at Nine, but I'm here today in a personal capacity. I agree with you, but ultimately we need more eyeballs. We're in the fight of our lives, and ultimately we can only take these risks if we find a new way to make money. So in your eyes, outside of savings on rebates, where do you see us making money in a digital world?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, Nine's a fascinating beast in that it's got a subscription TV model. It's got a free model in Nine Now. I think Nine Now and 7 Plus are going to. There's a game-changing turn coming with live sport, obviously, on digital platforms. And I think, my gut feeling has always been that we need to try as many new things as we can and see what sticks. The Nightly being a good example of that, or Streamer being a good example of that. I'm interested to hear the Daily Mail is about to start asking people to pay for its content on its Australian website. I think we just got to try as much stuff as possible. And I think that lack of risk-taking has always been the scariest thing for me, or always been that idea of, no, we've always done it this way. But what we know is that journalism is still embraced by Australians. And that figure that I spoke about, I do genuinely think it gets lost on people, that every single night we have a reach of nearly 4 million people in this country. And as the fragmentisation of what we watch at night changes, that's a big figure. Forget about Baby Reindeer on Netflix, right? That does not come anywhere near close to the 4 million reach that we have. And I fundamentally think we don't do a good enough job of selling ourselves too. We need to find a better way to communicate with advertisers about the absolute power of what we do. And I think that gets lost in traction a lot as well.
Hi, Anthony. Sophie Ellsworth from The Australian. You've changed the news reading lineups in many cities, including Brisbane just a few weeks ago, Sydney. The question is, Melbourne, will the lineup now for the 6 p.m. news be the same when ratings start again in February?
Well, firstly, Sophie, congratulations on winning a news award and your promotion. You're going to the UK soon, right, to work out of London, so well done. Look, I'm going to completely be a wimp and defer to Chris. You can ask him later if the... No, in all honesty, I mean, look, at the end of the day, what we're doing in Melbourne right now is working. Since Chris has come on board, we have gone from losing by an average of about 50,000 every night to winning every other night, most nights. So it's a strategy that's working, and we're obviously bringing in fresh faces like Karina. Chanel's here today, who's awesome and did an incredible spotlight job recently and breaks a scoop every night. But at the moment, what we're doing is working. So there's nothing sort of on the agenda that I know of. Chris might have a different view.
Hello, Anthony. Callum Jaspin from The Age and The Herald. You sort of mentioned the global proprietors who own social media platforms such as Elon Musk and the sort of erosion of trust on those platforms. Would you ever pull 7 off any of the social media platforms, particularly if the likes of Meta refuse to eventually play ball with the government?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I would lie if there hasn't been times when I have thought, when I was at the West, for example, about why are we on X? The margin for error on X is pretty small anyway. You might get 200,000 people like your story, but only about 4 of them actually click through. But I also think, at the end of the day, we have we have an agreement with the public to meet them where they are, and I don't think we can erode the trust of where, if they're there, we need to be there. But it changes so fast that who knows where we'll be anyway. And I think it's just important for us to just keep pace. And what's fascinating too, I often talk about one of the things that has interested me the most, and getting back to that question about what does 7 and 9 do to find more revenue, I think we forget sometimes that what we are more than anything is a video content operation. And so even though those numbers at 6 p.m. are so awesome, the other thing that gets lost is that every single day on YouTube, we get about 2 million views from all of our clips compounded together. And so I do think there's also scope for us looking about how do we actually package up those clips in a smarter way to make the most of the fact that we are probably 7, 9, ABC, all of us are probably the biggest content producers anyway for YouTube, for Facebook, for X. And so, we just need to hold them to account and know our worth.
Hi, Anthony. Siobhan Gleeson from 6 O'Clock Advisory. We're a communications firm. You've in part answered my question, and it was around how do you reconcile your views about social media channels as being toxic, and I think most of us would agree, with obviously the prolific use of them when you, as media outlets, use the same channels to capture more eyeballs.
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is that we are the ones who have to hold them to account, right? And I think that's what gets lost in a lot of this discussion about Facebook and social media and X and everything, is that the government's only option for holding those tech giants to account is us. Like, we're the only ones who are holding them to account. We're the only ones that are going to uncover stuff. You should watch Phil Goyen's done one of our 7 producers. Phil Goyen has produced an amazing series for 7news.com inside Meta. But they're the only things that are ever going to hold them to account. The government can scream and cry and all of that sort of stuff about these things, but the only thing that holds something to account is journalism. And so we can change them and make them do things, but we need to be helped along the way, and we need to be staffed accordingly, and we need to be given funding and given a chance. And if we are given those chances, we can hold them to account. And then the next thing will come along, right? But fundamentally, I think that's the most important part, is that we need to be helped to strengthen what we do to hold them to account.
Thanks, Anthony. Stephen Brooke from The Age. I thought it was a terrific speech, a lot to think about. In Australia, we hear a lot. We probably hear too much about Rupert Murdoch, media proprietor, but very little about Kerry Stokes, media proprietor. You've obviously had a lot of interactions with him and his son. Maybe you could share a few insights about his attitudes towards the media and his passion for it.
I was going to say he'd probably reject that theory that we don't hear much about him. I will be slightly controversial when I say that I think that the Rupert Murdochs and the Kerry Stokeses of the world, I mean, they are inevitably some of the biggest funders of journalism. And so you hear a lot of stuff about how bad the Murdoch press is, and I was obviously a big part of it for a long time, but don't forget all the awards they win and all the scoops they do and all the holding to account that they have, right? And so I think fundamentally, if somebody asked me about Kerry, what was like the number one thing I could tell you about him, it would be that he loves journalism. And that's the truth. Like, he is a big supporter of news. And I think, that's the number one thing that I say about Kerry. And look, I'm fortunate that, he has given me advice and wisdom over the years, and I feel very grateful for that. But the number one thing I know about Kerry is that he loves Channel 7 and he loves the news.
Does he get in touch with you about various things if he sees stuff that he likes or dislikes?
No, I mean, he has never told me what to do when it comes to journalism.
Sorry, me again. It's obviously been a big year for, you sort of addressed earlier, for the culture in media companies, particularly in newsrooms. Do you think some of the reporting this year and some of the stuff that's emerged has dented the public's trust in media? And do you think that's something that we'll see going on?
Yeah, it's a good question too, Callum. Look, I like I said, I think I can't speak for the past, and I can't speak for situations that I wasn't involved in. But my number one thing I would say is that, actions speak louder than words. And so if you're a leader in any business, it's how you act and the choices that you make that represent the culture. And so, talk and all of that sort of stuff is very important, but actions are what matter to journalists, to your staff and to your employees. And I've always felt that you have to act, and if you act in the best of your abilities, then the staff will go with you.
So just on that question of trust, I mean, there's a lot of research out there now that says journos have a trust issue as far as the general public's concerned. How do we deal with that? How do we take that on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating one. I mean, I think there's always been these surveys. I mean, anyone that's ever been to university will tell you about how the lecturer has told you, the journalists are the second least trusted job other than used car salesman. I don't know if that survey ever exists, by the way. It's just an anecdote that's been passed over time. But I also think, I think my overriding sense of what we do for a living is that the public actually really values and embraces it. And, Callum, you mentioned, what we've been through and what have you. But I do think even during all of that, there is a sense of pride in Channel 7 and Channel 9. There is a sense in the Australian suburban home that when there's bushfires and when there's floods and when there's criminals that need to be held to account and, even on a smaller scale, when you're battling cost of living and you need help while there's a current affair, I do feel that in the Australian family, suburban lifestyle homes, there is a deep sort of love and affection for our brands, Channel 7, Channel 9, ABC, all of those things. And I think we would often do very well to sit back and thank our lucky stars that that's there, but also realise that it's a privilege, that, we need to respect that we have over decades earned that trust and live up to it.
One final question, I think. Sophie?
Anthony, I just wanted to ask you about the Spotlight expose you did on the ABC, the Heston Russell saga. They still haven't finished their investigation. ABC said it would be done by the end of this month. We're nearly at the end of the month. What's your view on this and the view that it took Channel 7's reporting to lead to the ABC being held to account on something that has proven pretty problematic for the broadcaster?
First and foremost, I'd say that I can only presume, Sophie, that you've asked the question of the ABC of when it's due. But the other thing I'll say, and look, I'm very proud of the fact that I've never publicly, used my own voice to criticise other journalists or other journalistic endeavours, right? I mean, I think what we do for a living is pretty hard. It's actually very, very hard, and we do our best to fumble through the dark with a torch, and we make mistakes. I've made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, and so I'm not ever going to use my own public voice to criticise another media outlet. But do I think as a whole that we should all be held to account? Then yeah, of course we should. We hold institutions to account, so it's only fair that we ourselves get held to account as well. But I'll leave the questions of the ABC to yourself. I'll read it in Monday's media diary.
Thanks, Anthony. Would you thank Anthony de Ceglie for a terrific address? Thank you.
Thank you so much.